Well, hello from London. Good morning or good evening, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for this the second of three events in this year's Science for a Sustainable Future series that's being organized by my colleagues at Springer Nature and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. Today's session is called Beyond GDP, Finding the Right Measure for Progress. My name is Ehsan Massoud, and I'm an editor at Nature. I have a number of responsibilities, including editorials and our news coverage from Africa and the Middle East. And I'll be your host for the next hour. I was delighted to be asked to chair this because some years ago I wrote a book about the story of how GDP became what it is now, the world's preeminent economic indicator. And I wrote it very much as a sort of student understanding something from the perspective of science policy, where so much of science funding is linked to economies. And I felt I needed to understand that more. And of course, what better than to actually to do this through a book. A few quick housekeeping points. I wonder why we still call it housekeeping. Anyway, this event is in Zoom webinar. Please send us your questions in the Q&A or the chat. We will have to mute you and cameras turned off, which I hope is okay. We are recording the event and the recording will be shared afterwards. If you drop out of the webinar at any point, which I believe is a complete occupational hazard, please use the same login and you can rejoin us when you're ready. So on to the main business. Today's research question is about GDP. It's the most important metric for managing economies, say many. It's 80 years old. Is it fit for purpose? And I'm asking this question, or we're going to discuss this question specifically in relation to the SDGs. Does its continued use, for example, conflict with some goals? And I'm thinking here about those that relate to the environment, inequality, boosting well-being. We know that the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is worried, so much so that he's asked the chief executives of different UN agencies to investigate. And one of those things is a dashboard of metrics to complement GDP. What should those metrics be? And how can they be developed in an inclusive way? GDP is, of course, still with us. And so should the world also consider greening GDP or making it more inclusive in other ways, which is something that India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi revived as an idea just last month in a discussion with Bill Gates. Well, joining us on the panel are four experts who have thought and worked in this area for a long time collectively, and I'm hoping they will help us to steer and think through some of these questions. I'm going to describe them in alphabetical order. So first off is Dr. Jessica Espay. Jessica studies the global governance of sustainable development and is based at the University of Bristol here in the UK. Her PhD is in the use of science in multilateral policymaking, and she is the author of a book, Science and Negotiation, published by Springer Nature. Jessica is a former director of SDSN, and prior to that worked as an advisor to Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Next is Felix Fuders. Felix is professor of economics at the Universidad Austral de Chile and has been a visiting professor at Erlangen University in Germany. Felix is also the author and co-author of several books, and I'm just going to mention one, How to Fulfill the UN SDGs, which is published by, you guessed it, Springer Nature. In his sort of bio that he sent to us, Felix, I'm going to ask you a bit about this a bit later. He calls GDP the main disease of our economy. He's also involved in the development of a new indicator as an alternative called the Human Scale Development Index, and we'll hear more from Felix about this. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yongyi Min. Yongyi works for the UN Statistics Division in New York, and she is the chief of the Sustainable Development Goals Monitoring Section. Yongi is also the lead author of the annual Global SDG report, which I'm sure everyone on this call has read and reads every year. I certainly do. One of her roles is also to oversee the work of the Interagency and Expert Group on SDG Indicators, which is a group of experts that is currently reviewing the global indicator framework. And I hope, Yongi, you might want to say a little bit more about that. Yongi is also a veteran of the MDGs. How many of us still remember that? And so she's certainly got a lot of experience in this. And last, I'm going to mention Zakaria Zundi. Oops, I need to find my notes. I beg your pardon, Zakaria. I will find it. I am very sorry, Zakaria. I have mislaid your introduction. Would you like to tell us about yourself?
Hi, everyone.
Please accept my apologies.
It's okay. It happens. Don't worry. Thanks for the introduction. I mean, preliminary introduction about myself. I'm Zakaria Zundi. I work for ISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and we're currently working on a new measure beyond GDP, which we call comprehensive or inclusive wealth. We're currently working on three countries, Trinidad and Tobago, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. We did a similar work with Canada, and we tried to expand to other countries. I have a PhD in economics and a master's in economic data science. My work experience includes the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, the United Nations ESCAP, Asia and Pacific, and also the UN DESA. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you so much, Zachary. And again, please accept my apologies for mislaying your bio. Let's stay with you while we have you here. All of the panelists were given the first question to think about, and this is in relation to Antonio Guterres's call that we need to complement GDP with some additional measures, maybe 10, maybe more. And we asked all of the panelists to think about what your top three might be. So first off, Zakaria, would you agree that GDP should be complemented, and what would your top three measures be?
Thanks. I think it's really important to hold this discussion now as we're heading to the Summit of the Future this year in September, where this issue of moving beyond GDP will be fully discussed, with the hope that we come up with a concrete solution, concrete actions that can lead to an expanded measure beyond GDP. To your question, yes, I agree with the UN SDG that we really need to move beyond GDP. If you take you go to the World Bank data bank or any international institution database and you look for GDP data, look at the trends over time, and pick any proxy. It could be in nominal values or constant or inflation adjusted term, or in local currency or United US dollars. You will, most of the time, you will always see an upward trend. So this tells something very important here. It tells us that GDP is always increasing. I mean, the total value of GDP always increasing. And this comes from the fact that, except in extreme situations such as crises, pandemics, we always see a positive GDP growth. And now the issue here is whether that expansion of GDP means that we're heading toward the right direction, because this is the impression we always have, that when GDP goes up, things are moving toward the right direction, that we're doing pretty well. If that is the case, then why are we experiencing biodiversity loss, pollution, the increase in climate-related disasters and infection, rise in discrimination? And in fact, the World Justice Project estimated that 75% of the 142 countries they have studied worldwide, in those countries, discrimination really increased. And more striking, the UN SG also mentioned in the policy brief about this topic that from 1970s up to now, global GDP doubled, but the depletion of resources more than tripled. This is quite concerning. So there are two things here. Either GDP has been lying to us, or we have not understood GDP properly. So I'm more in favor of the second one, because in fact, GDP measures what happens on the market side of the economy. There's so many instances, so many situations where GDP is simply blind. So that's why it's really important we take this aspect, the non-market aspect of the economy, into account. And this is what the UNSG and also other global leaders, including the OECD, the World Economic Forum, UNCTAD, and others, they fully agree that we really need to move beyond GDP and develop new metrics that will take into account what really matters for prosperity. Now, in terms of suggestions, there are a few suggestions in the UNSG.
Maybe just one. I mean, we're a little bit running tight to time.
Yes.
I mean, we can always come back to more ideas, but just before we move on to Felix, what would you want to mention one or two?
I would just mention one, which
Yes.
we're currently working, the comprehensive or inclusive wealth, which takes into account 5 main assets: produce assets, natural assets, human capital, financial capital, and social capital. The World Bank and UNEP have been working on that, and IS is currently doing similar work in different countries.
Right. Thank you. And would you say, Zachariah, that inclusive wealth would complement GDP, or would you like to replace it?
I think the message here is to complement, because definitely GDP will remain and will still be important. The idea is to complement GDP, and so that we will have a more balanced policy making that will take into account both short-term and long-term. While GDP looks at short-term, those beyond GDP metrics, including comprehensive or inclusive wealth, will look at a long-term impact of our short-term actions.
Brilliant. Zachariah, thank you so much, and for keeping to time. Same question to Felix.
Yes,
does GDP need to be complemented, and what with?
Yes, I agree. The GDP was never intended as a measure of population well-being. In short, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, as Robert Kennedy once said. It counts goods and services produced. Well, this is good insofar we want to measure the economic values produced by a country. But if we want to have an indicator for development or even well-being, GDP is not necessarily a good measure. To say it in the words of my dear ex-colleague and Right Livelihood Award winner Manfred Max Neef, GDP is a quantitative measure. It is about counting things. Development is qualitative. It's about people. Well, my 3 favorite indexes are, the first one is the UNDP Human Development Index, which next to gross national income includes measures of population, longevity, and education. However, this Human Development Index is not a real alternative to GDP, since it contains economic growth as one of its variables. But I like it because you can find data from all countries in the world. So it's not the methodology which I like. I like it because it's so easy to access. Better than the Human Development Index is the OECD Wealth Life Index, which is a really multi-dimensional index that contains 11 variables or dimensions, among them housing, income, and work-life balance. It is visible for each OECD member country at a glance with a unique symbol. This is why I like it. It's a flower whose petals each represent one of the dimensions. And the higher the score in the dimension, the longer the respective petal. And this way, the total size of the blossom represents how good or not good are the dimensions fulfilled. And people can even interact on the index's website, giving subjective weights to the dimension. So the respective petal will become broader, and this can change the overall outcome of of the, and thus the ranking of the index. So the length of the petal is objectively measured, while the width is subjectively defined by users of the website. However, the Better Life Index is about counting things too, things that the OECD believes to be representative for development. And in this, it is similarly materialistic as GDP. And my favorite index is an index that is not flavored in this way, but it is not very well known yet. It was designed at Universidad Austral de Chile and combines subjective well-being perceptions with objective dimensions. It is called the Human Scale Development Index. It is based on the Human Scale Development approach of Manfred Max Neef et al. And measures the subjectively perceived satisfaction of fundamental human needs. May I see the slide, please? Fariel? Yes, thank you. So the Human Scale Development approach is a quite unique and innovative form to define development. Development is defined here as satisfaction of fundamental human needs. Max Neef et al. Defined this matrix, which we see here, of 9 fundamental human needs in 4 dimensions. The idea was not originally to measure development, but to give development planners a tool to assess what is needed in order to improve development. And in a participatory and inclusive workshop, the status quo matrix is built. That is, each cell is filled with the satisfiers or destroyers that we find in the closed environment. And then in a second step, a utopic perfect matrix is built, where participants of the workshop fill in all theoretically thinkable satisfiers. So, and by contrasting the status quo matrix, that is to say the current situation, with the utopic perfect matrix, we can get an idea as to which extent our fundamental human needs are satisfied. So then we can put numbers in each cell from, let's say, -10 to +10. And then we have as a sum, the quantitative outcome of the subjectively perceived satisfaction of fundamental human needs. We would permit negative numbers because some cells might contain only destroyers and not satisfiers, or pseudo-satisfiers, and so the need could be negatively satisfied. So this index is at the same time quantitative as well as qualitative, and it is subjective, but also objective, since it is about clearly objectively defined needs. And also the index foresees the weighting of each cell, and this weighting can be assessed also subjectively in the workshop. So what makes this index so rich, in my opinion? It does not depend on dimensions or indicators that respective authors of an index believe to represent development. What really matters is whether fundamental needs are satisfied. And this is what we measure here. For example, some indexes use the access to potable water or physician per capita as indicator for development. But if we live in the countryside, in the mountains, next to a river that has the clearest water from the glacier in the mountains, do we need then potable water? And if we live there and grow our own food and live without stress and probably get less ill, we will need less physicians. So physicians per capita or hospital beds per capita or access to potable water can be an indicator, but it doesn't need to be. It depends on the circumstances people live in. This is what
Felix, sorry, can I hate to cut across you. I need to bring in on this question Jessica and then Yongi. If it's okay for the moment, if you can hold your description. I think we're going to be discussing your individual suggestions as we go forwards. But thank you again, and well done on condensing your entire concept into one slide. That surely must deserve some kind of award. Let's go to Jessica.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thank you to Springer Nature and SDSN for bringing us together. This is a brilliant and fascinating discussion, and as is made very clearly apparent by that great overview that Felix just gave us, there are people on this call that are way more expert than me at sort of the indicators and the metrics for measuring different forms of well-being. So that's not what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to kind of, my work is more concerned with governance and kind of the politics of how you get these agreements through. And so with that in mind, I wanted to kind of instead stress two principles and two kind of conditions that I think are going to be essential to move forward this discussion. The first is that whether you're looking at the great work that we've just heard from the University of Chile or the HDI or the OECD Better Life Index, or indeed Oxford University's great work on the Multidimensional Poverty Index, I think there are kind of two cross-cutting principles to all these alternative approaches that need to be at the center of any discussion about what's going to complement GDP. And I think these are, firstly, regeneration as a concept and equity as a concept. And I say regeneration because previously we traditionally use the term sustainability, but sustainability implies a level of balance that we are far beyond. And so I think the point now is to try and emphasize the regenerative capacity of people, of things, of goods, of society, and the sort of circular nature of how our economies must evolve. So I think that's first and foremost sort of a fundamental principle of any measure that's going to complement GDP. And secondly is equity. I think it's well known and has been argued for more than 30, 40 years that one of the biggest challenges of GDP is, of course, the fact that it has no sort of a sense of distribution or the equitable achievement of those goods and services for different members of the population. So I think with those two principles at the heart, whatever measures the Secretary General's task force comes up with, or any of the brilliant institutes out there that are working so hard on this, needs to keep front and center, and that needs to be at the center of any political discussion that ensues at the Summit for the Future. In terms of, so I'll pause there and not talk more about the kind of specific measures, which I think we can go into in more detail in a bit. Just two other points I wanted to make are that we can have technocratic discussions about what the measures should be until we're blue in the face, and we can go round and round and round, but ultimately we need to get the politics right in order for this to work. And by meaning getting the politics right, I don't just mean waiting for the right wind to blow and for the stars to align with lots of political leaders who are interested in this. What I mean is I think that there are quite a lot of institutional processes that need to be promoted in order to get this topic on center stage. So the first thing is that GDP is now such a prevalent and dominant metric that the only way we're going to have a meaningful conversation about a parallel or a complement to GDP is to put it front and center of all the most significant decision-making forums. So the UN General Assembly, as the sort of highest level of democratic governance, is of course first and foremost, and this will be tabled at the Summit for the Future in September, so that's a great first start. But if it's going to become a meaningful anchor of international deliberation, it needs to be at the top of the agenda every single year. Every single GA needs to not just defer to the UN Statistical Commission, which is the entity I'm sure Youngli can tell us more about, that collates kind of comparable international statistics. It needs to actually be politicized and put into the political dialogue every year about how are our measures of not only gross domestic profit, but these other measures of regeneration and equity that we as a global community have agreed to monitor. And there needs to be an active political discussion with heads of state and government about that every year. It also needs to feed into other incredibly influential political forums like the G20 and the G7 and the EU and all the other regional economic commission dialogues. Otherwise, again, likewise, it just won't maintain the level of political interest, and it won't be able to compete with the level of economic interest that we have in GDP as a society writ large. I think the other thing I wanted to highlight, and I must apologize because my fire alarm is going off. Hopefully there's not actually fire. Yes, the other thing I wanted to just emphasize is that as we've seen from the huge numbers of NGO movements, advocacy groups, EU discussions, AU discussions, there's huge popular interest in this topic. It seems like it's quite intractable and technocratic, and sort of something that should be removed to the level of technicians. But actually, intuitively, the idea that we need to measure something more than our output is something I think everyone in society can understand and can engage with. And as we saw during the SDG negotiations, there were incredibly large and meaningful civil society-based dialogues about what those future goals should be. And so I think we need to take this out of our kind of more technical circles and actually think, how do we encourage a much more popular debate? And how can the UN lead that to actually have kind of meaningful buy-in and inclusive processes to devise what this final metric should be? leaning on the experts to identify the sort of menu, if you will, but then leaving it to the general public to decide what actually has the most traction and is most intelligible to the general public. So I think we also need to give some serious thought to how we popularize this discussion beyond technical communities such as ourselves.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And I'm going to put you on the spot. Favorite indicator?
Oh, I mean, I think speaking to Felix's point before about accessibility and kind of having something that's intuitive, I'm a big fan of the human development indicator, but also the multidimensional poverty indicator that Oxford have been promoting for a long time and working with UNDP on, which is based on Amartya Sen's capability approach. I think it's very sort of intuitive and quite holistic. So I kind of feel like availability of data is crucially important at this point. So we should look at quite a few of those measures before we perhaps get too ahead of ourselves.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jessica. And last but not least, Yonghi, a lot on your shoulders. I've seen you in action. It's quite a job that you have to do to sort of manage the process for all of the goals and indicators. Is it fair to ask you to name 3?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I know that since the adoption of the GDP, I think back in 1944, that economists and the statisticians have long argued that GDP is not a good measure of our progress and well-being. So I totally agree with what Jessica just said. It's not a technical process. It's both a political process and technical process. It's really needed the political buy-in. Based on the Secretary General's policy brief, so we will want to have a dashboard of 10 to 20 indicators. So based on that, I will not go to index. Of course, I agree. HDI is definitely a very long-lasting, standing, reputable index that we used, and also the OECD Wellbeing Index. So I will maybe just go to the indicators. Maybe my top 3 indicators instead index. I will say one is already included in the HDI, will be life expectancy, which is not included the current SDG indicator for different reasons. It's not because it's not good indicator, but it's because no target required, like ask for this. So life expectancy is definitely a powerful indicator to measure the population overall health status and the quality of life, and also capture factor like access to nutrition, access to quality health care, and also maybe cover some environment conditions. My second top indicators, I will say maybe CO2 or GHG emission, but because with the climate change is one of the biggest climate challenges. So this data is very critical to inform the mitigation policy and setting targets and track progress for country on climate change. It's also aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement, which has emission reduction targets. And the third indicator that I will say is maybe a indicator that can capture inequality, such as the Gini coefficient or Palmer ratio, that can capture the distribution wealth within the society. So based on that, I will say, and there's definitely a lot more than the different important indicator that's not probably going to be come out, but we'll see if we want to have 10 to 20, that we really need to focus on the outcome indicators. Because in the SDG process, we have a lot of mix of implementation indicator with different input indicators, but the outcome while looking at the success. So last year we did assessment, only 15% of the SDG targets on track to be achieved by 2030. But if you look at the among the 15%, many of them actually is input on the policy indicator instead outcome indicator. So to measure the success of beyond GDP, I will focus on outcome indicators.
Yonghi, thank you so much. And just for everyone here, you heard it first, Yonghi's top 3, so maybe they might end up somewhere: life expectancy, greenhouse gas emissions, and inequality. We also, we had HDI gets a lot of thumbs up. I'm a little surprised at that. I didn't realize that it is still so big, particularly as it doesn't include the environment, but clearly has a lot of traction. OECD Wellbeing Index as well, and also Felix's proposed indicator. I guess one thing that this discussion throws up is that there are these and other, Zachariah also mentioned comprehensive wealth, inclusive wealth, depending on whether you take the World Bank's or UNEP's terminology. Since the Human Development Index tried to dethrone GDP, in the words of its creators, they haven't really succeeded. And I know, Jessica, you talked about the political dimension to this. Why do you think that the alternatives, including now the SDGs, why do you think they've struggled to get that traction? And I'll start just coming back to you, Yongyi. Why do you think they still struggle? I know you're very involved in this, and there's possibly a limit to what you can say, but what's your view on this?
There's too many, for example, for the measures beyond GDP since I don't remember, like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, a lot of people started criticizing and starting to find many measurements. And then I think OECD study find out that there's over 500 like different initiatives on beyond GDP on different indexes. But I found it's none of them have really like taking have attractions and become popular. SDGs a little bit more successful, but it has embedded shortcoming of too many, because currently we have 169 target and 231 unique indicators. That it's very difficult to tell a holistic stories. So when I'm struggling while writing the annual report, what's the key message? Because there's so many different directions, and you talk about like a health outcome, you talk about environmental degradation, and you talk about there's a difficult to have a whole key message. So when people always ask me, what's your key message from this report? I said, well, there's not one key message, there maybe a few key messages from the report, but this is like a difficult to communicate, like for example, 231 indicator. So that's why a dashboard of 10, maybe 20 indicator maybe be attractive, and it's not a simplistic just one index. The index also has its shortcoming and the advantage and shortcomings. I will say that 10 to 20 like a focus outcome indicator may possible if we have the similar process like SDGs. SDG has a merit that I think there's a lot of really good communication and buy-in from the global society, from politicians, academia, civil society, even private sector. They always can find something in the SDG for themselves. And so that's in terms of communication, it's very successful. But in terms of measurement, I think it's a bit challenging to communicate the measurement. So 10 to 20 indicator, possibly if we go through the same process like SDG, and it possible can bring people's focus not only to GDP itself, but also to other important measurements of well-being and society.
Thanks so much, Yongyi. I'd like to bring in Felix at this point, actually, because you clearly have a new contender, and I'm guessing here that you really don't want this to just stay in the pages of amazing journals like the ones in Springer Nature, and you'd like it to to get out in the world and start to have some impact. What are your thoughts on this question about getting traction? You're still there, Felix?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
Your question was why is GDP still so important, right?
This is a question really about the alternative indicators. So like the one that you're developing or co-developing, you've developed the indicator, you clearly think that it's got, it's clearly, you can differentiate it from the ones that are there. How are you going to make it? What are your ideas on actually making it something that that organizations or countries will use?
Well, what we need, I think, is an index that measures how people can satisfy their fundamental human needs. I also like the subjective well-being indexes that just ask, how is your feeling of your overall well-being right now? Just one question, one very simple, and people can say, yes, I feel 70% satisfied. But these kind of indexes are very strongly flavored by events that happens in the interviewed persons in this moment they were interviewed, like someone died in the family or they had an illness or something. And also, if I say, yes, I'm 70% satisfied, well, what's the reference? How do I know that I'm not 100% satisfied? How would I define 100%? And this shortcoming we overcome in our human scale development index, because we have clearly defined needs in 4 dimensions. And if we construct the current metrics with all the satisfier we have now and contrast it to the utopic perfect matrix, where we put in all the theoretical thinkable satisfier, so then we have the contrast, and then we can say, yes, we are.
But you know, Felix, it sounds from what you're saying, Felix, that you've sort of developed what you and your colleagues regard as something really good, and you kind of want, you know, the policymakers to sort of to take it and then run with it. Is that correct? That you actually don't think that it's the role of you as a researcher to go and advocate for this and to actually, you know, to do, as Jessica says, to do the politics and to do the policy?
Well, the thing is that we have to convince that this is a good index, and maybe it could be published in an important journal like Nature, and then more people can read about it and know about it. Well, and one another thing is, because why do we still hang on the GDP? And this has to do with the fact that what we know from empirical observation, that we have to grow 3% GDP in order to unemployment decrease 1%. We call this in economics the Arthur Ocon's 3-to-1 thumb rule. But we do not really understand what the dynamics behind this rule are. Is it greed, or is it a growth fetish, as some believe? Probably this has to do with the design of our monetary system, especially with the design of our money. And meanwhile, we do not repair this flaw in our design of our money. We will always have to grow. We'll have this growth imperative, or otherwise we will see unemployment. And since no politician wants unemployment, this is why GDP is so important. This is why economic growth is so important. So if we really want to get rid of this growth fetish, we have to, in my opinion, change our monetary system that gives a growth imperative. I don't know if the time is enough here to explain this for more detail. I can do it, but I need at least 3 minutes more.
I would say that's another topic, the new monetary system, where I hope maybe is on the call, and Farial. I think this is one for SDSN and Springer Nature to maybe think of for the next as a future topic. It's an absolutely fascinating question. I just want to bring in Zachariah. Zachariah, you're also advocating, you know, strongly inclusive wealth, comprehensive wealth, and again, there's been, you know, reports and publications and you know, lots of fanfare when it's you know, the press releases land on the desks of people like myself. But it isn't really breaking through. So what's the plan? What are the blockers? Zachariah, from there.
Yeah, well, I'll try to be really brief because the time is I think the issue here is political interest, because we so much used to GDP and like political when you see some of those indicators we use for policy making, like the central bank, for instance, it refers to inflation and GDP growth. You have debt over GDP that is used as a reference for lenders. You have a public expenditure for education or social spending, for instance. They're all usually expressed in terms of a GDP. So we have this. There is this countries are so much used to GDP that is really hard to make that shift. That's why the message around these new metrics have to be quite strong, and they have to be involved throughout the process. And I think that is one of the points mentioned by the UNSG. It has to be an inclusive process where countries would take part to the process. And getting back to the point mentioned by Yongji about the process, the success story of the SDGs, that's, I mean, the consultations were also one of the reasons why the SDGs was so much agreed across the world. So in this current project, we got those countries involved throughout the process, because they're the ones that are going to use those indicators. They're the ones that are going to implement those. They have to be involved. And more importantly, we have to come up with a common single language, like single framework for all countries. Otherwise, there will be a lot of
I mean, just on the question of common language, I mean, what's your thoughts on just unifying a unified term for the concept that you work in? We have comprehensive wealth, we have inclusive wealth. My understanding is that they are broadly similar, but there are some differences. You know, could we move to a unified term?
I think it's going to be quite a challenge, because every institution try to promote their own terminologies, and that's a real challenge for the United Nations. So what's going to be important here is what we're trying to measure, and probably we can come up with something that is different from like everyone, you know, not trying to favor any institution, but to come up with concrete measures that can really address the challenges we are facing.
All right, Zakaria, thank you so much. I'm just for this last bit, before we open it out we're gonna take some of the audience questions. Jessica, I'm not hearing, I don't know if you would agree with me, I'm not hearing great sort of enthusiasm for your proposal that we kind of got to do the politics here and understand it and engage with it. It's like, you know, lots of us are in the research world, and we sort of want people to accept that we do good research and good science, and that's kind of it.
Yeah, thanks, Hassan. I absolutely look at the spectrum of people you've got on the call here. We're all by nature, academics or technical specialists, and so that is kind of probably where we're most comfortable thinking about the technical solutions to this knotty question. But ultimately, as with anything that is aiming to try and effectively change the world, you're only going to have traction if you can mobilize political players, right? And I think there's two meaningful ways we're going to do this, and that we have to engage with the Summit for the Future and beyond. The first is having really meaningful discussions about the political levers that are going to affect change, right? We're basically going up against an entire, as Felix has already illuminated, you know, GDP is so entrenched into our global monetary system that we're going up against an entire incredibly complex economic, you know, sort of superstructure that we're trying to kind of coerce into doing something different. And the only way that we're going to encourage it to do anything different is by having very strong incentives and regulations through the big, large-scale institutions of global governance that are going to sort of mobilize corporate actors, you know, regional development banks, lending institutions to adopt additional measures. So I think the first thing is that, you know, not only does this need to be a conversation amongst heads of state and government within a forum like the General Assembly, it needs to be a conversation amongst all the multilateral development banks and all the major lending institutions to say, let's make this, let's, you know, agree on this common additional set of metrics, and let's make them mandatory for all discussions about loans, grants, whatever it might be, and sort of have some agreement on what that sort of tactical approach is going to be. The next thing is that, sorry. The next thing is that we also need to I think there's actually quite a lot. It's quite difficult to think about affecting change at such a huge global level. But actually, if we've seen from, you know, the European Union with regards to GDPR and so on, actually regional action can have huge trickle-on effects. So sorry, GDPR being the information and data management standard employed in the European Union in order to regulate how we use private data and information. And although everyone said at the beginning, this is a, you know, very niche European sort of metric, it's never going, standard, it's never going to apply to other countries and regions, it's had a huge knock-on effect for practices worldwide. So I think there's a lot that different regional entities can do in order to kind of move forward this conversation and make these metrics much more commonplace. And then, as I said before, and then I know I need to stop, there's also, I don't think we can underestimate the power of popular pressure. I think actually, as we've seen through, at the city level and regional levels around the climate dialogues, having meaningful conversations with general public and engaging them in the fact that you should hold your leaders to account on reporting on these measures can actually be incredibly impactful for over time changing political activity and action. So I think we have to look at those two levels as well in concert with these more technical and political discussions.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and again, thanks so much for keeping to the time. Let's move to some of the questions that are now coming in, there's a couple on climate, and then Yongyi, I'm going to address these. I'm going to probably address these to each of you separately, so that way we can get through more questions. Yongyi, you mentioned that one of your favorites, is greenhouse gas emissions is climate, and really the question that's being asked is in relation to reporting. CO2 emissions have now for some time been the center of attention, but we are now in the climate crisis. Is reporting the right place to start if we're to achieve the SDGs? And I'm guessing that part of the reason maybe for this question is that the climate reporting in the SDGs is different to the reporting that's happening elsewhere in the UN system.
Reporting climate changes as a CO2 emission and also other climate indicators is very important to sound the alarm, but the political action is lacking. So at least we can sound the alarm, but also everyone experience the real effect. I think now currently it impacts almost everyone, and we can feel that impact of the climate change. But there's a clear target on CO2 emission. If we take the action of reducing this target to zero net by, I think, 2055, then we can reverse this trend. So this gives you the direction that we're not there and we're far from there, and what need to be done and reduce fossil fuel emission and the subsidies, all this that action that need to taken to reduce the CO2 emission. So have this outcome indicator, but look at this action that how to can achieve to reduce the CO2 emission is very important. And I definitely agree. If we don't report on this impact of the climate change and the outcome in the real target of the income, then we don't know where we are. We only experience the impact of the climate change.
So just on that, Yongyi, I know that there is a review process that you're overseeing on the SDG indicators. It's is there scope for a proposal or proposals around greenhouse gas emissions reporting? Would you think, if someone were to propose, some sort of alignment with, let's say, Paris targets or other targets, could that be considered?
Greenhouse gas emissions currently is already under the SDG indicator framework, so we added under the 2020 comprehensive review. It was not included because it's not good measurement. It's because we're limited. We're bound by the targets, but we managed to add it. My struggle is actually not about the indicators. We don't have. I cannot find a good source of global data on greenhouse gas emission. Currently, the UNFCCC only have the Annex 1 country reporting annually that, and for Annex 2, which most covers the most developing countries, the data is very outdated. We have relatively good CO2 estimation data from, for example, IEA, but so far, I haven't found a really good source of GHG emission. So now, normally when we do report, we report on the greenhouse gas concentration from WMO data and to use the CO2 emission data and to tell the stories.
Well, there's a challenge, if there was one, for our audience here. Yongyi, thank you. So you're saying that at the moment, the UNFCCC Annex 1 data isn't sufficient for your purposes, and what I'm hearing you say is that actually there's an opportunity for researchers and policymakers to perhaps think more broadly about the kind of data that would satisfy your data quality requirements. That's fascinating. Thank you for that. Let's move on and have some more questions coming in. So we've had a few questions about life satisfaction and happiness as an indicator. Felix, can I bring you in here? What's your thoughts about happiness in terms of its measurement, in terms of how we might report it?
Yes, as I just mentioned before, I like these indexes that just ask the question, how do you feel satisfied with your life, or how happy you are, just on a scale 1 to 10. I like it because it's subjective and you know how you feel. And I like it because of the subjective value. On the other side, how do I know that I'm 100% satisfied or 100% happy? Maybe it will be more happy tomorrow. So this is the main problem of these indexes to measure happiness or subjective well-being is the reference. So yes, we need some objective measures. For example, objectively defined fundamental human needs. And then we can decide in these needs, how do I subjectively perceive my satisfaction of these needs? So it's good to have a subjective index, but it has to be in some way objectivized to have the measure, to have the contrast, the reference. So how do I, so that I will know how much I'm satisfied or not in this objective dimension.
And well, one other one for you, Felix, has just come in. So one of our audience members has been looking for the Human Scale Development Index online. And they ask, is there an app or a multimedia source where we can access?
Yeah.
I did a quick search and only spotted the HDI and others, but not the Human Scale Development Index. How can we find it? Will you?
It has been published in 2 book chapters in Spanish. It has not been published in a broadly accessible English-speaking journal until now. So, but I can send a translation of the Spanish book chapter to any person who sends me an email, and I'm happy to share these thoughts.
All right.
And hopefully we will soon publish it in English in an impacted journal.
Great. Thank you. What we'll do is we'll pass on the details to the colleague of ours who's asked that question. Another question here. The work of Professor, I think it's Lance Pritchett, says there's no country with a low GDP that has high social indicators. I guess this speaks to your point, Felix, and also Zachariah earlier, that really, there is a big role for an economic indicator. Is there a divergence between GDP and other indicators at higher GDP levels? Let's go to Zachariah for this, and then Felix, maybe you might come on this as well.
Yes, there are so many examples. We can mention biodiversity is, I think, is a straight answer. Pollution. To boost GDP, often we have to destroy part of our nature. We have to pollute. So GDP goes to the right direction, but the climate and environmental indicators go to the wrong direction. And as we sometimes say, if you destroy an entire forest, you convert that forest into timber or woods or paper, and you export. Your export is going to be boosted. Your GDP will go up right away. But is it sustainable? No, because you're leaving nothing for next generations. And then you have inequality and discrimination and other factors too.
So does that, just, jumping on your answer, Zachariah, Felix, does that mean that actually there's a sort of almost like a disconnect between the imperative to grow and the imperative to go green?
Yes. Here I can also again cite my dear ex-colleague Manfred Max Neef, who published in 1995 his so-called threshold hypothesis, which says that countries at the beginning, they start growing GDP, and the development indexes go hand in hand synchronously with GDP, but then comes a moment then when GDP grows, but the development indexes, sustainable development indexes, for example, do not grow in the same way. They're getting, there's being a lag between the two. And this is because, as Zachariah said, we will destroy the environment if we grow. If we grow, there is destruction. We need always input and energy. Maybe we can get more efficient, yes, but we can never produce a good without any input. So if we grow in the long run, we will destroy. So steady GDP growth in the long run will destroy the environment. And yes, if a country is very poor and people are unsatisfied in the fundamental human needs, they need to grow. They need to produce more goods and things to be able to satisfy their needs. But then it comes a point when this is not necessary anymore to satisfy fundamental human needs. And then might be that the destruction gets more important relatively to well-being than the extra gain from more GDP growth. But again, in our today's monetary system, there is inherent a growth imperative. This means that we have to grow, otherwise we see unemployment. And this is also bad for development, right? Politicians all over the world want to foster GDP growth because they don't want unemployment. And we see this dichotomy even in SDG number 8. SDG number 8 says we want economic growth and decent development, right? Decent workplaces. This dichotomy comes from the fact that we either grow or otherwise we see unemployment or precarious working conditions. Unfortunately, the reason behind this dichotomy is not well understood in orthodox economic teaching. We have to change this. And if we change this and we can change the monetary system, which is easily to change actually, then we can get rid of this growth imperative. And then we can start to develop in favor of people and not only in favor of gaining money. And actually, this is the topic of my book you just mentioned, published in Spring and Nature.
Here we go.
It's about how we can change the concept and role of money in order to be able to fulfill the SDGs, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in a comment from one of our audience. And our commenter says, it's disappointing that there's no expert on the panel on life satisfaction. The question is, taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? And I'm just going to go around our esteemed panelists with that question before we end the webinar, starting with Jessica. How satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 0 to 10? In the spirit of indicators. Sorry, you're still muted.
Is this a question for us to answer or to
yes,
discuss?
Question for you to answer. Just in general, it doesn't have to be you personally, but just, you know, in terms of what's happening in the world, how satisfied are we with what's happening on a scale of 0 to 10?
Oh gosh, on a 5?
5, okay, woo. Okay, thank you, Jessica. Yongyi. Scale of 0 to 10.
Yeah, I'll probably agree with Jessica for 5 to 6, I guess. 5 to 6. Oh, a bit more optimistic. Okay, well, you are in the UN. You've got to be optimistic. Okay, Felix.
Well, in the world, yes.
Yes.
Maybe about 5 to 6. Personally, 9.5.
9.5.
I don't know. Maybe tomorrow we'll be more happy. But for my reference, which I have today, I think I'm pretty satisfied.
Okay, that's great to hear. Hopefully this webinar has helped.
Yes.
Sorry, let's turn that off. Okay, and Zachariah.
Yeah, I run 5 and 6, and personally I would say 8 because summer is around.
Okay, well that's also good to hear as well. Okay, well, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Jessica Espe, Felix Fudes, Yongyi Min, and Zachariah Zundi, our brilliant panelists, and also for being so game with that last question. Sometimes these can be a little bit unfair, but we do push our luck sometimes in my line of work. Thank you to our amazing audience, especially for your questions. Thanks to Maeve Dunn and Farial Zubair, my colleagues at Springer Nature. Next week, same time, please come back for a discussion about migration. Migration, the missing link. And in the chair will be my senior colleague, Magdalena Skipper, who's Nature's editor-in-chief. That's the 2nd of May, same time, Migration, the Missing Link. Thank you all once again. Really, really appreciate it. It's been a great discussion. It's been lovely to meet you all. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.